Good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah from Sourdough for Beginners. I am going to mix up the level 2 hydration beginner bread recipe, talk about the essential processes as I go, and show you. You can just follow along and see how to mix up the bread, see what it looks like when you are feeling the bread and working with the bread with your hands. Answer any questions that come in. So if you're watching, post your questions in the comment. I can see them. I will get my starter refed after I mix. I also am going to be giving some starter away to a friend, so I'll show you how I do that. And then maybe we'll do our first set of stretches and folds and just sort of go over the process. In the description of this video, there's about 75 links up there. And the way those links are set up is that depending on where you are in the process of making sourdough, whether you're just starting out and making your first starter, or you're trying to troubleshoot getting your starter to activate, or you're trying to mix your first mix your first dough, figure out your timing, whatever it is, those links are kind of set up as you go through the process. So if you're here and you're watching me and you ask some questions and I get them answered for you, and then you want to watch sort of more an extended tutorial on that, you can go through and find the bulk proofing success video, or find the pre-shaping video, or find the video for people who don't have a Dutch oven. So all of those sort of long form ones are there, but these lives are fun because people tell me all the time, oh, I thought I understood that, but then when I watched you actually do it, I learned something I hadn't necessarily thought of. So I am going to get my starter into my bowl. So my starter was fed recently. It's doubled. It's actually started to fall a little bit, but it's still super active and bubbly. And I'm going to mix a double batch today, which is going to make two full-size loaves of sourdough. So here's my starter, nice and active and bubbly. It's happy. So for the level 2 hydration, I'm going to spoon 200 grams of starter into my bowl. If you were doing the beginner bread recipe, you would be using 120 grams. So we always suggest people start out with the beginner bread recipe, which is lower hydration. It has less starter and slightly less water. It just makes the dough easier to manage with your hands and handle. It makes it less sticky. But it does produce a denser loaf. So you wouldn't necessarily stay with the beginner bread recipe forever. The point of the beginner bread recipe is just to get you comfortable, make it so that you understand what the essential processes are, make you sort of have this opportunity where you can start mixing sourdough for the first 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 times and get comfortable with what the processes are, how they happen, how the dough feels. And then once you start getting really good loaves, you can increase your hydration. So the level 2 hydration is 200 grams of starter. And now I'm going to add 700 grams of water directly into my bowl. And I just re-tare, so I'm using a scale. I do have a cups version if you don't have a scale. I'm not sure if that's in the description, but I'll get it posted in the comments. So let's pour 700 grams of water in here. So the idea of all the tutorials that we make on sourdough for beginners is you're totally new. There's lots of stuff that you don't know yet about sourdough, but the easiest way to learn this stuff is to just get in there and start trying. But we try to make it so that there's processes that you would really need that you don't miss. And then there's also processes that you don't necessarily need and could just confuse you more or cause more problems. So a really good example is that for your first 1 or 2 loaves, we suggest that you do a same day bake. So what that means is feed your starter before bed, get up early in the morning, do your mix, right? Get your stretch and folds done, get your dough into bulk proofing containers and watch them as they grow. So bulk proofing should take somewhere between 4 and 8 hours. Overnight on the counter is almost always, like 95% of the time, entirely too long, and you end up with an overproofed dough. And then we say, once it's bulk proofed, pre-shape it, shape it, score it, bake it, all in the same day. with that beginner bread recipe and without cold proofing, you're going to have a slightly more dense loaf. It's going to be slightly blander, not as much sour flavor, but it's going to make it so that you're a lot more comfortable. And then once you're sort of throwing this beginner bread recipe into the oven all the time, you can start to go, okay, well, I would like the loaf to be a little bit less dense. Let's add some hydration. You know, I would like to get some more flavor and gluten structure into my dough, so why don't I start cold proofing? But at that point, you're really comfortable with all of the really important processes. So in my bowl, I've got my starter, 200 grams, and my 700 grams of water, and I've just used a whisk to dissolve the starter into the bowl. Now I'm going to add 1,000 grams of flour. You can use any blend of flour that you like. We do suggest that beginners stay under 20% for a sturdy flour just until they're comfortable, because whole wheat, spelt, rye, einkorn, ancient grains, oats, all of those flours absorb more water and rise faster and are much stickier and tougher to deal with. So we think you should do that after you master the essential processes. So you can use bleached all-purpose, you can use bread flour. Usually what I do is about 800 grams of regular all-purpose flour and then 200 grams of like a spelt or a whole wheat. But we've got the kids coming and the kids like all white bread. So for this one, I'm just gonna measure 1,000 grams of regular all-purpose flour into this mix. So I'm just gonna tare my scale back to 0. And you know, you don't need a scale. You can do it with cups. We've converted all of our recipes to cups. The Essential Processes ebook that we sell actually shows how to do baker's math and convert from cups to grams and everything else. But I actually like my scale because it makes it easier. I don't have to worry about measuring anything. I can just keep pouring like I'm doing and talk to you guys and just keep looking at the number on the scale. The scale I have is from Amazon. It's like 10 bucks. It comes next day. You don't need it, but if you, honestly, if you were going to buy any one thing to increase your sourdough success, I would say just get the scale. Just makes things easier. Most of the recipes out there are only in grams, and it's frustrating for some people. Lots of you in here. Yay, I'm glad you're here. If you have questions, post them in the comments. So now I have 1,000 grams of flour in here, and I'm going to add 20 grams of salt. And remember, this is a double recipe. This is going to make 2 loaves for me. So I'm just going to pour my salt in until I get to 20 grams. Here we go. Perfect. So I'll just move my scale out of the way now. So I've got my starter and water dissolved on the bottom of the bowl. I've just put all the flour and salt on top. So essential processes versus advanced or optional processes. An optional thing is a levain, where you take, oh, Susan, thank you so much. So generous of you. I love getting the stars. They're fun. So when you're out there and you're a newbie and you're learning about sourdough and you're on Google and you're reading everything, you're going to see lots of processes. So let's talk about what some of the advanced ones are. A levain is where you take some of your starter out of your jar and feed it separately from your jar. The purpose of it originally was to control the hydration of your starter. So say, for example, you wanted a loaf that was really not very sour at all. You might feed that levain on a 1 to 5 to 5, so heavy flour. But when you're a beginner, it's just not necessary. You can just feed your starter in your jar and dump it into your dough. Later, when you're super confident with sourdough and you're starting to expand on your skill set, then it makes sense to start playing around with the levain. The next one is what's called an autolyse. So an autolyse is where you take your flour and you add the water to it and you mix your flour and water and you let just the flour and water sit for a long period of time, 6, 8, 10, 12, overnight. And what happens is that the flour itself starts fermenting in sort of the same way that a starter does. And then what you do is you add in your starter, get that mixed up, and then add in your salt and get that mixed up. Again, good processes. They might affect the overall set of the bread afterwards, the taste, the way it rises, the way it looks at the end. But as a beginner, these things are not necessary. Just dump your starter into your bowl, dissolve it with some water, get your flour and salt on top, and get it mixed up well. Then we start looking at things like very long stretch and fold times, very long rest periods, you know, all of these things. All we're trying to say for beginners is at first, keep it very simple. Just get to a point where you're comfortable with how the dough feels. So I've used my spoon and I've mixed up this dough until basically all of the water is absorbed by the flour and the salt. And now I'm just going to use my hand and I'm going to get this dough sort of mixed as well as I can on this first mix until it creates like a shaggy dough. On the first mix, you don't really have to worry about how well it's mixed because you're going to do 4 sets of stretches and folds. So next advanced process is that some people determine the strength that they've built in their bread based on using the window pane effect. And I talk about it in the beginner bread recipe. Or they have all sort of different ways to build strength into the bread. But most of the time, beginners don't even understand what stretching and folding is for, what it is that you're trying to do when you stretch and fold. So if you start getting into those advanced processes, you're not necessarily doing yourself a solid. The better thing is just to understand what you're trying to do. So stretching and folding is very similar to kneading in regular bread, except that sourdough is so sticky that if you tried to knead it, it would stick to everything. And so it's just a gentler kneading process. And what we say is, over time, as a beginner, once you get comfortable with your sourdough, you'll be able to see and feel that you've built enough strength in your dough. You might only need to stretch and fold 3 times, or depending on what you're doing, you might need to stretch and fold 5 or 6 times. But with the beginner bread recipe and all of the essential process recipes that we have, because we have the beginner, the level 2 hydration, the 100% whole wheat one, we've set all of these up on the YouTube channel. What you can do is say, I understand that I'm trying to build strength into my bread, and 4 sets of stretch and folds will do that for me good enough, kind of thing, right? So what I've done is I've mixed this dough up to a shaggy dough, and I just want to show you how the dough starts and talk about how it should end before you get it into the bulk proofing process. If you look at my hand, the dough is very sticky. If I try to pick this dough up, it won't. I can't grab the dough and pull it up in one piece. As you do stretch and folds, even on the first set of stretches and folds, the dough gets stronger. The gluten structures start tangling around each other, and eventually, by your 4th stretch and fold, you'll be able to grab that ball of dough, pick it up all in one piece. It'll come, and you could even like bounce it, and it'll have what's called elasticity in it. So that's what we're trying to do with stretching and folding. And this is why we're trying to simplify the processes for beginners, because the number one complaint that we get about sourdough is it is so sticky. I could not do anything with it. And the reality is that it's supposed to be sticky, but there are techniques in place that make that stickiness manageable. So I've got this mixed up, and normally what I would do is I would let it sit for about 30 minutes, and then I would do my first set of stretches and folds. But what I'm going to do for this live, especially since there's lots of you here, and I'm glad that you're all here, is I'm going to refeed my starter, talk a little bit about starters. I'm going to share some of my starter with a friend. And then even if it's only been 15 or 20 minutes or so, I'll get that first stretch and fold in, and I'll show you how as you go, the dough starts sticking to your hand less and starts sticking to itself more. And that's how you start to get that feeling for how the dough should feel. And then I'll just show you the bulk proofing containers. So when I do these lives, I kind of always start at this point in the process. Another interesting thing is that it's noon here in Ontario, and usually I mix early in the morning because I almost always do same day recipes, but I still have a bunch of bread left. So most of the time I don't cold proof, and the reason I don't cold proof is because I need my bread. But with beginners, I always say don't cold proof just at first, because if you made a mistake early in the process, especially during bulk proofing, cold proofing will only magnify it. So just, it's an optional thing. Leave it out just for a little while. Don't go buy bannetons and everything just yet. And then once you start getting those ones, you can add it in. Since I'm starting so late today with mixing my dough, by the time I'm done stretching and folding, it'll be almost 2 o'clock. And then by the time it's bulk proofed, it'll be somewhere between 6 or 7 o'clock at night. And the kids are all here. I won't feel like baking. I know I won't. So what I'll do later tonight is I'll pre-shape this dough, let it rest for a bit, get it shaped, and get it into the bannetons, leave it in the fridge overnight. And then tomorrow when I'm fresh, I'll bake it. Because of the fact that I know I'm going to cold proof tonight, I'm only going to let this dough rise to 75%. If you were planning to bake the same day, you want to let it rise to 100%. Denise says, good morning. I just did my first stretch and folds for the day. Awesome. Yay. So sometimes people come on and mix along with me. So I'm just going to set this aside for a minute. Usually I just take my hand towel that I'm using and sort of drape it over top of the dough, just to keep my cat from sniffing at it and from it drying it from the air, etc. So I have used up my starter. So a couple things. I've got a girlfriend who wants some starter, who wants to try and make some of her own sourdough. So I'm going to spoon 60 grams of my starter out of my jar and put it into this jar for her. And then I'll just sort of pop this jar inside of here, and she's going to be talking to me for the next couple of weeks until I get her all set up. So she's going to end up with the same sort of starter jar as me. So first of all, let's do that. So if you're just starting a starter, that's exactly what I did yesterday. Yay! If you're just starting out with a starter and you do have a scale, then the easiest way to feed it is to discard back to 60 grams every day and refeed it 60 grams each flour and water. Then when you go to make the beginner bread recipe, which calls for 120 grams of starter, you take 120 grams out, it leaves 60 behind. You almost never have to discard because you can always pour into your bread depending on what you're doing. A cool thing that you can do when you first start making your starter is weigh your jar, right? So this jar weighs, let's go back to 0. So this jar weighs 185 grams, right? So if I put 60 in, what's that math? That means that 245 grams equals the total of the jar plus 60 grams of starter. So every day when I go to use the starter out of this jar, I would know that I just take back until there's 245 grams there, and then I don't have to worry about what my base is anymore. This jar is too small. It is. You want to make sure that your jar leaves at least enough room for your starter to triple, because then you never have to worry about it overflowing. And we are firm believers in tightly sealed lids on our starter. If you look at this lid, I don't know if you can see it on video, but this lid is kind of puffed up, right? So when your starter rises, it creates gas, right? It grows, right? And if your jar is too small, then your lid will pop off and your starter will overflow. But we don't believe in having loose lids or breathable lids. I do not believe that a starter needs yeast from the air to breathe or any more air than it gets when I open it to use it. I do believe that using a sealed lid prevents mold, prevents fruit flies, just keeps the starter contained in its own environment. So just make sure you're using a nice big jar. I rescue these from the delis. Pickles come in them. All right, so we're going to get this back to 0, and we're going to spoon 60 grams of this starter into this jar. And then my friend will have enough starter to get started with sourdough. So she's got 60 grams in here. She's going to pick this up later today, and she'll probably feed it tonight and bake with it in the morning. So I'm just going to put this in here like this, and that's her little package. Most recipes say to not seal lids, Joanne says, and Susan says, will this live be saved so we can view it later? Susan, yes, all of the lives are on the page at Sourdough for Beginners. I'll create like a little reel that'll bring you to them. It'll always be there. You can definitely come back. There's also a ton of lives. I do these all the time, just because there's always new people in here. We're up to I think we're going to hit 35,000 followers today. So if I can help some people, so I know that it says out there that you should use a breathable lid. I know it. I'm aware. And what I always say is this: not all starters that mold had a loose lid, and not all starters with a loose lid get mold. But in the Sourdough for Beginners group forum, where we've got 700,000 members almost, the admin team and I, 95% of the starters that we troubleshoot that ended up with mold or the crusty top on them were loose, breathable lid starters. And then when the person changes and starts using a tightly sealed lid, it solves the problem, right? And I guess the only other thing I have to say to support my position is I'm on here baking live every day. This is my starter. Her name's Mama. I would like to think she's a little bit famous. You know what I mean? People are watching and using the beginner bread recipe, and mine are always sealed and it's working perfectly. So I just don't think there's an argument out there that would support having a loose lid, or as if it's something that you need. I don't think it's something that you need. So Hildy says, I do not like any sour taste, but have recipes that call for a levain, for a lievito madra, an Italian starter, which I need for a European recipe. Can I use your starter for that? Sure you can. Yeah, if it calls for any kind of starter for this Italian recipe, just follow the directions. In regards to sour flavor, there's two ways to affect the flavor of your bread. One is to use your starter past peak. So usually we feed our starter, we wait for it to double, and we aim to use it at peak. But we can use it after peak. We can even use it after it's fallen. The longer past peak we use our starter, the more it's fermented, the more alcohol it's gone. That's going to increase the sour flavor in your bread. So even as a beginner, if you're not using cold proofing, you can play with when you use your starter and adjust that flavor that's in your bread. And then another cold proofing adds flavor to your bread, right? The bread spends the night in the fridge continuing to ferment and continuing to build that gluten structure. So a cold proof will absolutely help. I'm not saying that cold proofing is bad. I'm just saying that beginners should consider skipping it until they're comfortable with the process. Susan says, awesome. Jim says, why does Tom say don't use a scale? I don't know. I think Tom from the Sourdough Journey does use a scale. I've never seen that before. I think what a lot of experienced people say is that once you're comfortable with the process and you understand it, you can do it without a scale. But I'm not sure why he would say that. I'll have to, Jim, why don't you post a link so that I can look at it? Because I really respect Tom. I really like Tom. I've done lives with him before. I've chatted with him quite a bit. He's a real scientist. Like, he's a really sciencey guy, and he's been in sourdough for a really long time. And I always say that people start with me and get comfortable and then graduate to him and start doing all of his crazy scientific stuff and experimenting. And, you know, we see his posts in the group all the time. I don't know why he would say that, but I would be definitely interested to hear why. That's the thing about sourdough, is that there's just so many different ways, and all you got to do is find the one that works for you. Susan says, I just pulled my loaf from the oven. It doesn't look like a hockey puck this time, so hoping the crumb is good. Yay! And Joanne says, okay, didn't know. Yeah, there's lots of stuff out there, right? And I think what happened is broken telephone. I think somebody one time said, I'm going to leave the lid off my starter and see if letting it breathe works good. Oh, that worked really good, right? And started sharing that. And from this best practice of, hey, try this, try it without a lid, right? It became like a rule. And the other one we see is don't use plastic for your starter. Broke it, right? Don't use metal with your sourdough. Broke it. I'm making perfect loaves every day. Don't use bleached all-purpose flour. It works fine. Are there better flours? Yeah, of course. Is there more nutrition in the other flours? 100%. Do you not want the enrichments that they put in white flour? I can understand that, right? But these rules, like, you can't, I don't like those. I try to avoid those. I try to tell everybody, anybody can do this. Will my hard rolls rise if I don't ferment very long? Usually you have to let your dough double in order to get them to rise. Okay, so we've caught up on all the questions. So now I've depleted my starter quite a bit. I only have a tiny little bit left, and I like to keep a lot on hand because I bake a lot. So I am going to refeed this starter 100 grams each of flour and water, because that means if I go to mix the level 2 hydration recipe again later, I'll have 200 grams, 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of water in here. So it will be ready for you to bake with. Once you have an established starter, you can feed it what it needs. It doesn't have to be an exact ratio anymore. The only reason we suggest using exact ratios like 50 grams starter, 50 grams water, 50 grams flour, or a quarter cup of starter with half a cup of flour and a quarter cup of water while you're establishing your starter is just to maintain consistency and get it to activate. But once you've got a strong and happy, healthy, active starter, you can adjust it a lot. I'd say there's probably around 50 grams of starter in here. I'm going to feed it 100 each of flour and water. That's technically like a 1-to-2 ratio. But for me, the most important thing is getting my starter to the point where I have enough for what I want to do for baking. So I'm just going to get 100 grams of flour in here. And then I'm going to get 100 grams of water in. So I'll just tear my scale back to 0. Let's see here. All right. So you can already see the starters coming way up higher again. I already have lots on hand. The only reason I have 2 starters is because I bake a lot. And so these are both the same starter. They're both mama, but I just grew her bigger so that I have the option of being able to mix a double batch of the level 2 hydration loaf, which would be 200 grams each, so 400 grams altogether. I also, as you saw, frequently share my starter with friends, and I dehydrate starter. You know, I use a lot of starters. So I created a second starter jar and the only reason I have 2 jars is because I want to make sure I always have that room for the starters to triple in the jar. If I had one of those huge gallon starter jars, and I always say when people send me stars, like happened earlier, I save all those stars up. And then once I sort of accumulate, 20 or 30 bucks, then I go on Amazon and I buy some new tool to show on the channel. So if I ended up with one of those huge starter jars, then I wouldn't need 2 jars. But I don't think I can fit a huge starter jar in my fridge. So I would have to commit to baking almost every day because then my starter would live on the counter. So my starter is refed. I'm going to let it double on the counter. And then once it's doubled on the counter, I'm going to pop it in the fridge at double. And then next time I bake, I'm going to bake with it straight out of the fridge. I like a sour taste in my bread. And I bake every 2-3 days. So that's one way to manage your starter. Another way to manage your starter is to feed it 4 to 12 hours before you bake what you need for your recipe. Wait for it to double, put it into your recipe, and then put it back into the fridge unfed. And then just always do that, right? We do say to maintain it, try to keep it, try to feed it at least once every 7 days or 4 to 12 hours before you bake. Starters can live in the fridge for 2, 3, 4 weeks, months, whatever it is. It's just that they'll ferment all the way to alcohol. So if you want to just keep it happy, then make sure it gets fed once a week. Or the last thing you can do if you're an everyday baker is mix your dough, refeed your starter, and leave it out on the counter and use it every day. So I just saw Hildy. You're amazing. Glad I found you. How often do you do lives and at what time? Thanks, Hildy. I try to go live often, but I have a busy life just like everyone else. So it really depends on what's going on in my house. I usually only do lives when it's quiet around here. Or like the reason I didn't go live today until noon is because my husband was on a Zoom call and me talking super loud like this would have been distracting. We don't have a huge house. So I try to go live fairly often. I try to go live every Saturday to mix. And if I don't go live on Saturday, then I definitely try to go live every Sunday. Sometimes I do both. So it's more likely to happen on the weekends. And then of course, every Monday night, if you go to the top of the page, there's a pin to the top. Every Monday night I go on StarCam, which is, you have to download the app, it's free, but basically it gives you the opportunity to upload videos to me. So you can come into the StarCam and sort of watch everybody else's questions being played, watch the answers that come in, and then you can actually upload a video question. You can ask me directly, you can show me your bread, your dough. So those are really good ones to come into on the Monday night. That's every Monday night at 7 p.m. Eastern Eastern time. And there's an event for that on the page that you can go follow so that it reminds you. Susan says, I got confused and fed mine before I put it in the fridge after using yesterday. Did I mess up? No, you can't mess up your starter. It's fine. Just let it double. If you're feeling worried, discard it all the way back to a small amount, refeed it. It should be fine. When you bring your starter after keeping it in the fridge, do you have to wait till it comes to room temp before you feed? Nope. I use my starter straight out of the fridge. I use my dough straight out of the fridge and bake them. I don't ever let anything come to room temperature. Hildy says, do you put or send messages when you will go live? I try, but usually I just pop on, and Facebook's really good about notifying people when you're live. Like, Hildy, you found this. So if you, I know that people who, so there's 3 different kinds of people who can follow a Facebook page. There's followers who are just like, oh, cool, I want to see what's happening here. Then there's people who have actually liked the page. That's like another level. And I think that everyone who likes the page gets for sure a notification when I've gone live, whereas Facebook will just notify some followers when there's a live. And then there's this new like subscribers thing. So I've got, I don't know, a few people have subscribed. It's actually kind of neat. I think you have to pay for it. It's $4 or $5 a month, but then you become a subscriber. And I've been doing like posting some of the videos earlier for them and that sort of thing. I don't fully understand it yet. It's fairly new for Facebook, but I would say just follow the page. But Hildy, for sure, the one that's set is Monday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern time. It was at peak when I put it in the fridge, Susan says. Yeah, that's how I do mine. I feed mine, let it peak, then I put it in the fridge. And then if I bake within 2 days, I'll use it straight out of the fridge without refeeding it. If I bake 3 or 4 days later, then I will discard it and refeed it. So now we've been at this for a bit. I always say get your dough mixed to a shaggy dough and let it rest for 30 minutes and then do your first stretch and fold. I don't know if it's been quite 30 minutes for my dough, but I'm going to do my first stretch and fold and talk about that strength building and what we're looking for when we're feeling things. Eliz says, I'm pretty new in this sourdough era. You helped me a lot understanding everything. My breads are coming out great. Hang on a second here. I have to push C more. How long can I keep the bread proofing in the fridge at most? The longest I've ever gone is like 3 days. And I did find that it was overproofed. I've seen people say they went like 4 or 5 days and it still turned out kind of okay. But I think that the consensus is with cold proofing, anything more than like 24 to 36 hours, the dough starts to kind of lose its shape and everything else. The longer you leave it in the fridge, the more flavor you get, but there's kind of like a breaking point where it just fully overproofs, and then when you take it out of the fridge and try to bake it, it falls, right? And we don't want that to happen at all. Cool. Okay, so let's do our first stretch and fold. So here's our dough. It's very shaggy. There's still some spots where there's like dry flour. It's not mixed up well. It's still very sticky. So on this first stretch and fold, it is going to stick quite a bit. So I'm just going to get my hand just damp, not wet. We don't want to really add any hydration to the dough, but we do want to try and prevent the dough from sticking to us during stretches and folds. When I do my first stretch and fold, I'll be able to rip this dough. I'll be able to come way up high and it'll just rip. By the end of this first set of stretches and folds, the dough will start to resist me, right? So we will start to see the dough where if I pull on it, it won't go high like that. It'll take longer to rip. You can actually see and feel the dough getting strengthened as you work with it. And this is why I always try to do these lives and these videos, because you can read all about stretching and folding, but you'll never really get it until you try. So my hand is damp. I'm going to reach way under my dough and watch as I come up, stretches lots, breaks. I'm going to fold it back on top of each other. Now I'm going to continue that process around this dough, and I'm just tilting my bowl so you can see. So I'm just going under and flipping it on top of itself. Sticking to my hand, yes. But if you were here at the beginning of the video and you watched me when I mixed, my whole hand was like a clump of dough, right? So it's already getting stronger just from the 30 minutes rest time and from this process that we're doing with the stretching and folding. On your second stretch and fold, it'll stick to your hand less. And by your fourth stretch and fold, it'll almost not stick to your hand at all. You'll be able to pick the dough up, break it in half into your 2 loaves for bulk proofing, and it won't be stuck to everything. This is why we consider stretching and folding one of the essential processes. So for this first set of stretches and folds, I'm just going to go around, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 times. And what you'll notice is that the dough is a little smoother now, a little less shaggy than it was. It's not sticking quite as much to the bowl. If I try to pick it up, it's still going to rip and it's still going to stick. But as you can see on that first stretch and fold, when I grabbed it and pulled, it would come way up here, right? Now, if I grab the dough and pull it up, it won't come as high. It's starting to get some elasticity. It's not ripping as quickly. It will rip eventually. There you go. As we build strength like that, that's what's happening with stretching and folding. So with this dough, what I'm going to do is let it rest for 30 minutes, stretch and fold it 3 more times. So let's say at 1 o'clock, I'll stretch and fold, 1:30, I'll stretch and fold, 2, I'll stretch and fold. And then I'm going to separate the dough into 2 loaves and get it into the bulk proofing containers. And I'll just show you those really quick. The number one most important process that will have the biggest effect on your bread once it is baked is the proofing process. There's 2 kinds of proofing. There's bulk proofing, which occurs after stretching and folding and should happen on the counter or in a warm sort of room temperature environment. And then there's cold proofing, which happens after shaping. And the dough just goes into the fridge to sit there, and then it comes straight out of the fridge and goes into the oven to bake. Cold proofing is optional, bulk proofing is not. The thing about sourdough is that sourdough does not rise like a yeast bread does. So if you've ever made yeast bread before and you leave it to rise, you put it into your bowl, it's in this nice little ball, the ball expands in all directions, up, right? And you end up with this bigger ball. Right? And you punch it down and then you get it shaped and maybe you let it rise again and then you bake it, right? Sourdough does not act like that. Sourdough spreads. Sourdough goes to the easiest place that it can go. So one of the things that we see all the time is my dough's been sitting there for 12 hours and it's not rising. And the reality is that 90% of the time it is rising, but you're just not seeing it because you started off in this big angle-sided bowl, right, with your dough like this, and it spread, it did double, now it's overproofed, but you didn't see it, you couldn't see it because it was in here. So we suggest using clear straight-sided containers. So these are just basic, like Rubbermaid, you know, Walmart, semi-reusable Tupperware containers. These work great. Some people have like round glass Pyrex style bowls. As long as the container is around 2.5 times the size of what your dough is going to be. So this recipe makes 2 1,000-gram loaves. And these containers are 8 cups, I think. Yeah, 8 cups, 1.89 liters. I don't know what that works out to in quarts. It might be 2 quarts. You get your dough separated into a single loaf. You push your dough into here. And now your dough is touching almost on all sides. There will be voids. It'll be higher here and lower here. And so we actually take a marker and mark our height of the dough. 4 hours later, you can look at this and go, you know what? I think it's doubled now. It's still going to be an estimation because the dough will never sit perfectly flat, but being able to visualize what the dough has done to see that, oh, well, when I put it in here, you know, it was not touching over here, but it was high over here. It was like this. There was a big void here, an air pocket. And now I'm looking at my dough and it's fully filled the container and started to go up in height. You can start to say, oh, okay, well, I think maybe that's 75%. Or Jim, I'll answer that starter question in just a sec. I see it there. That's a really good question. Now, we always say, if you're going to bake the same day, double your dough, 100%. If you're going to cold proof, then let your dough go to 75% because it will continue to rise in the fridge once you get it in there. Now, when you put your dough into these containers, you're not just looking for it to come to the top, right? Because that would be way more than double. By the time you take your dough out of the container, and there is actually a video in the description of this video, and then there's like lots of bulk proofing videos on the YouTube channel once you get there. If you go into the YouTube baking playlist, there's like videos that say, here's why you should bulk proof. Look at these. Here they are at the thing. And if you're interested in this, then definitely go learn about these. But By the time I use this dough, my dough will be just under this line here when I put it in. And by the time I use it, it's only actually going to be like around a finger length above that here in the middle. But that's because that's where the highest part of the dough is. Over here in the corner, the dough likely won't even touch, or it'll be like down here. But by the time it's up here in that spot, it'll have quadrupled. Right? So using a container like this, it doesn't have to be rectangular. As long as it's clear with straight sides, you can look all the way around the dough and go, okay, well, here it's only looking like it's 25%, but over here it's quadrupled. And over here it's, you know, like more than doubled. And overall, I think this is where my bulk proofing should end. When you use this process, it also helps you to experiment as you go. So when you do your first bulk proofing and you get your bread in and it comes out and you go, that was a little dense, I think it might have been overproofed. Now you know, okay, well, I stopped here yesterday, I can go a little further. Or when you go to put your dough in the oven and it falls, it doesn't spring, and you post in the group and everyone says, oh, that looks overproofed, you can go, okay, well, I let it go to here yesterday, so maybe today I'll try it here. So this is like our bulk proofing success outside the beginner bread recipe. This is by far the most common thing that we troubleshoot for sourdough for beginners. So what's the rest of the essential process? Stretch and fold this 3 more times, separate it into 2 loaves. I use my scale just to make sure they're both about 1,000 grams, get them pushed into my bulk proofing containers, use my marker, mark their height, pop the lids on them, tightly sealed, sit them over beside the stove, let them, in my case today, because I'm going to cold proof, go to 75%. Then I'm going to pre-shape them, let them rest for 30 minutes, final shape them, and get them into the bannetons and cold proof them overnight. In the morning when I get up, I'll start preheating my oven. Now, if you're going to bake same day, start preheating your oven before you pre-shape. But if you cold proofed, get up in the morning, start preheating your oven. If you're using Dutch ovens or pizza stone, preheat those along with the oven. If you're using loaf pans, then get ready. Now your dough is already pre-shaped and shaped. So I pull my dough out like right before I'm going to put it in the oven, tip it out of the bannetons onto parchment paper, score them, get them in the oven, bake them. And people always ask me how to bake your bread. There's a million different ways and every oven acts differently, right? So I tried to bake at 450 at my uncle's house with his brand new oven and accidentally burned the bottom of my bread because his brand new oven is so hot. The maximum temp that my oven goes to is 450, and I am positive it does not hold that temperature. It's like really, really a low quality oven. The most important thing is that you're trying to cook between 440 and 500 degrees. That high heat is what you need to get your oven spring. And you're trying to get your bread to an internal temperature of 205 Fahrenheit. That should take somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour. If you're baking with a Dutch oven, you're going to want to do somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes with the lid on, right? Leave it on longer if your bread's getting too crispy. Take it off sooner if your bread's not browning up nicely. And then the second half, or 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it may be, with the lid off the Dutch oven so that the bread can brown up. Usually a good time to take the lid off the oven is after it's sprung. So if you check and the bread is sprung and the ear is starting to develop, that's a great time to take the lid off your Dutch oven. Jim just asked a question a while back about starters. So he said, after you feed your starter and it rises, how long can you keep it on the counter without touching it? So we always say, use your starter at or after peak, and you can use it after it started falling. If your starter is living on the counter, a good rule of thumb is to feed it once every 24 hours, right? But could you leave it much longer? Of course you can. What happens with starter is it just keeps fermenting. If you left flour and water on the counter forever, eventually it would become alcohol, right? It's just like vodka or anything else that you ferment, kombucha, whatever it is that you want to ferment. If you try to use that starter in your bread, it's probably going to rise the bread. It's just that you'll end up with like a very strong, sour alcohol flavor. So we usually say that if you are not baking every single day, you're better off to store your starter in the fridge. If you left your starter on the counter for several days and forgot about it, that's fine. You'll get there, probably have like a layer of hooch on top, like a grayish brown, like liquid. That's the alcohol that it's made. You can either stir that right in. If you like sour flavor, pour it off. If you don't like sour flavor, you know, give it a good feed. It might take 2 or 3 feeds, but get it revived. Starters are super resilient. So I guess technically the answer is a really long time starter could stay on the counter, but try to feed it once every day. Susan says, get an oven thermometer off Amazon. Best $10 I've spent minus my scales. Susan, I actually did. My dad had one and gave it to me. So here it is. But the problem that I have is that my oven is so tiny, so very, very tiny, that this doesn't fit anywhere. I know, that's ridiculous. So what I need to find is like a tiny little thing. But for me, I mean, I'm experienced enough that I can just tell when the bread is cooking properly. I've practiced so much with my oven. I've figured out like its sweet spot, and I think everyone needs to figure out their own sweet spot. But what I will say is that different days take different times for me. Different doughs take different times. The reason you can't ever really use sourdough for any form, you can't say you have to feed your starter exactly every 24 hours. You can't say that bulk proofing is going to take 3 hours and 57 minutes, because everything affects, the environment affects the sourdough so much, right? Your mix that you mixed today might have 2 grams less starter in it than your mix yesterday. And it might be a degree warmer today than it was yesterday. And so yesterday your dough might have taken 4 hours and 32 minutes to bulk proof, but today it's ready in 4 hours, right? It's the same thing with the oven. When I bake my bread, sometimes it takes 55 minutes. I've actually had it take like 70 minutes before. If your dough is overproofed, it might take less time to cook. If your dough is underproof, it might take more time to cook. If your dough is severely underproofed, it might never make it to 205 degrees Fahrenheit, right? There's just so many things affecting it. So it's definitely good for you to just practice and sort of use these essential processes that start as like a starting point, and then adjust them as you go until you find that sweet spot. And then once you can stick dough in the oven and get reasonably good or almost perfect bread every time, that's the point where you start adding the more advanced processes, increasing your hydration, thinking about cold proofing, looking at auto leasing, starting to play with levains with your starter, adding inclusions, right? All of these things. So let's see. Yeah, it took me a minute to figure out my oven as well. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. We did a reno on the house during COVID, and you could not get appliances. And so we were like, okay, we bought this little apartment size oven, kept the old fridge, and it was like, yeah, we're gonna get appliances once we can. And now here we are years later, and we haven't done it yet. Wanda says, I've tried 3 loaves and they don't turn out. Is it possible my starter wasn't ready because it's just now rising like crazy each feed? I would double its size, but now it goes way above half. Wanda, starters continue to get strong for weeks after they first activate. So it could be that your starter was a little weak, and now that it's like super active, you might get some better loaves. But in most cases, the issue is bulk proofing. If your loaves aren't turning out, something's happening in bulk proofing. So up in the description of this video, go find the bulk proofing success video and focus on making this perfect, making your dough perfect during that rise time. And I think your loaves will improve. If you overproof, can you fold and start over? If you overproof your bread, shape it and bake it right away. Just try. If it's severely overproofed, you're probably going to just have to make focaccia or end up baking a loaf that comes out quite flat and dense and turn it into croutons or whatever it may be. But if you think you've overproofed your dough, give it a really good pre-shape. The pre-shape is going to take that stickiness away, trap some good air in the dough, let it rest for a little bit, get it pre-shaped, get it in the oven. If your dough is only slightly overproofed, there's a couple of things that you can do to encourage oven spring. So once a dough overproofs, it'll fall before it can spring in the oven, and that oven spring is important. That's why we bake at high heat. So one thing that you can do is really pre-shape your dough as tightly as you can get it. And when you're shaping it, try to shape it as tightly as you can get it. There's a balance between, you don't want to degas it, you don't want to force the air out of it, but you want it to have like a nice tight skin. Score that dough, get it in, check it after 10 minutes. If it looks like your score is fusing rather than opening, so when you check your dough, your score should either still be like nice and moist and open, or even starting to develop a bit of an ear. But if it looks like your score is getting smooth, and we call that fusing, cut it again. That's one little trick that sometimes what we say. So if your dough is overproofed, pre-shaping will help save it, and that 10-minute hot score will help save it. New to this too, and have baked 3 loaves. First loaf, burnt bottom. Implemented your tricks with foil and pan of water. Good time. Second time, the 2 loaves were not done. We'll try again tomorrow. Mary, if you've got a meat thermometer, use that. So what I do is after about 50 minutes of baking, I start sticking this in. And I just keep putting it back in until it's 205 degrees Fahrenheit. Sometimes it seems like a really long time. Like sometimes I've actually left the bread in there for more than 15 additional minutes than I would normally think. Never go by time in sourdough. I'll say that for the rest of my life, I think. But try to use the thermometer. If you need more time to get the temperature up, but it's starting to get too brown on the outside, put your lid back on. Just keep cooking till it's at 205. I'm just glad hubby loves everything that comes out of that oven. Yeah, that's good. Eliza's saying because my stove is new. Okay, thank you. Susan Goodman, yes, mine too. It's like fancy. So all these new options I'm learning. Yeah, I'm jealous. I want a fancy oven. Is it okay to bake without cold proofing? Wanda, in fact, we recommend that beginners consider skipping cold proofing until they've mastered the essential processes. So yes, it is 100% okay to bake without cold proofing. If you've made a mistake early in the process, cold proofing will likely only magnify that issue. And so we just suggest that beginners pick a day where they're going to be there all day and do their first bake on that day. Feed your starter before bed, get up in the morning, mix your dough, do your stretch and folds, get your dough into your bulk proofing containers, keep an eye on them. When you think they're at 100%, pre-shape them, shape them, and bake them all in one day. Then you're going to have a loaf and you're going to be able to say, okay, what do I change now? You know what I mean? Did it taste too sour? Maybe I don't like feeding my starter before bed. Maybe I get up early in the morning and feed it and wait for it to double and use it right at peak because I know that's going to reduce the sour flavor, right? Was it a little bit dense? Should I have bulk proofed it longer? Did it fall while I was cooking it? Should I bulk proof it less, right? Let's get, did I find it very sticky? Did I experience how it got less sticky as I stretched and folded it? If you just follow these basic processes for your first few bakes, you'll be able to troubleshoot. And then from there, it just becomes, it's easy. It becomes second nature. All day kids are calling me lame because I just want to sit home and bake bread. I know. I make the kids. Mary says, thank you. You've been a tremendous help. You're so welcome. I'm so glad you're here. I actually really find this fun. I just told my husband a little while ago, okay, I'm just going to go do a mix on live and it'll only take about 30 minutes. And here we are. I think we're almost an hour in. But I like being here and I like talking to you guys. I like knowing that I'm helping you. The reason I started making these tutorials is because I'm self-taught, just like everybody else who tries to do sourdough. Not everybody, but almost everybody. And I struggled. I read way too much stuff. I didn't understand the processes. I had them mixed up. My stupid starter took 3 weeks to even start doing anything. It was over a month before it was ready. I struggled and struggled and struggled. And then eventually it started working. And I started sharing my starter with other people and they started having questions and I started typing everything out one by one. So then I was like, you know what, I'm just going to start a group and post, these things that I know there. And then whenever anyone uses my starter, they can just go into the group and, do their, I don't have to type it all the time. And now here we are, the group's got 700,000 members. The Facebook page has 35,000 followers. And all I do is just pay attention. All these questions that you guys asked me in the live, I pay attention and I say, okay, everybody's struggling with this. Let's address it. So, yeah, sorry, that's my backstory. I also started very broke. I had no money. We were going through some stuff here at my house. We were, our expenses were very high. Our obligations were quite high. You know, our kids are in school and everything else, and we were really struggling financially, and we really wanted to eat healthy. And it's tough to eat healthy in North America when you're on a shoestring budget. But literally, I was at the point where if I wanted to make this bread, I had $5. I could either buy store-bought bread or I could buy flour. And if I bought the flour and it failed, which it did, and I cried, you know what I mean? Then I wasted the money that we had for groceries. So one of the things that I'm really committed to with my following is you don't have to have any special tools. You don't have to use special flour. You know what I mean? Anybody who's out there saying that you do, they probably believe it. And I don't necessarily think they're bad people. Some of them are, but it's not true. You can make sourdough with what you've got laying around in your kitchen. I actually did an episode on YouTube where I walked into my girlfriend's kitchen and just made sure, I just said, I don't care what kind of flour, as long as you've got some flour, let's figure this out. I think everybody should be allowed to do sourdough. So let's see here. I've read so much, I still don't know what to do. After over a month, I've had great success with bagels and cinnamon buns. Yeah, but not my loaves. Wanda, check out the links in the description of this video. Start at the beginner bread recipe. Look at the timing, look at the bulk proofing success. Try to just follow those simple, essential processes, and I think it'll come together for you. And of course, we love those discard recipes. There's discard recipes up in the description too. Mary, I think my biggest issue is I'm trying to gather a ton of information from many different people. Yep. And some of it conflicts. Just going to pay attention to one right now, and that's you. Yay! I'm glad you're here. Yeah, there's a lot of information out there, and a lot of it conflicts, and almost all of it's valid. It's just, is it valid in the context? Are you using them in the right order? Do you understand what they're supposed to be doing? And too much information obviously will confuse you. So the way we've got the tutorials that are pasted in the description of this video, there's many more. Once you get on YouTube, I think there's 110 videos or something on YouTube. And there's something for everybody there. But the ones that we paste in all these posts that we've made are kind of organized in the order that you would want to use them. I think the starter was the biggest issue. My house is cold. Due to your spoiled English bulldog. Oh my gosh, I love English bulldogs. So it took a while. Let's see. With these comments, when they come in, I have to push see more to read the whole thing. And sometimes I just can't get it to do it. Let's see. Yeah, I don't think grandma's years ago had any of the stuff. That's a really good one. You see that post all the time. Sometimes it's really snarky. Sometimes it's true, like somebody literally is just genuinely asking the question, why do we have to measure? Why is this so complicated, right? How did the pioneers do it? The pioneers didn't have scales, right? The pioneers didn't have all this stuff, right? And that's a completely valid question. And here's what I can say to that one. After you master the essential processes, after you practice with 2 or 3 or 5 loaves and you get it, you have that aha moment, it becomes easy. And within 10 loaves, you will be able to mix this recipe, like your sourdough recipe, whatever it ends up being, with your eyes closed. You won't need the scale, you'll be able to do it, right? But here's the difference between the pioneers, okay? They had the oral tradition. Everybody ate sourdough back then. It was the only bread that there was to eat. Right? They didn't have commercial yeast. They had to make their own culture in order to make their bread rise, right? And so from the moment they were born, this dough was always there in their life. They saw it with their eyes. They saw how it got mixed, right? Their mothers or their fathers or whoever was the main person who took care of the bread at that time showed them how. Most of the people out there right now trying to learn sourdough are completely isolated. They don't know anybody who does it. They don't know anything about it, right? And they're just going on the internet trying to figure it out and encountering all of this conflicting information. You don't need any special tools. You can make sourdough base with, you know what I mean? Find a bowl, find some water, find some flour and some salt, start mixing. You can make it work with absolutely nothing. That's 100% true, right? But we do live in a modern world and scales make things easier, right? It's way easier to just dump stuff into a bowl than it is trying to measure things, right? And things like bannetons make our loaves look pretty, right? We don't need anything, but sometimes we want things, right? So I would never judge anybody on either side. And I don't love it when people are kind of mean about that whole pioneers thing, even though I do understand where they're coming from. So let's see, same third loaf, first two are flops, third one looks amazing. Yay, I would love that. I'm going to mix up your beginner bread recipe now. Yay, have fun. And the sourdough era sweatshirts are cute, I know. We have, okay, so you guys are on the Sourdough for Beginners page. The only person who can post here is me. This is where all of our tutorials go. We have the Sourdough for Beginners group. That's the one with all the members. That's where you can post, right? We try to get some good tutorials in there, but with 700,000 members and something like 11,000 posts a day, 8 administrators, we just can't get to everybody. But you know, we've got stuff pinned at the top. We're doing everything we can to reach and access. There's one other group, it's called Sourdough Marketplace, and it's starting to really grow. There's a couple thousand members in there. If you make something and sell it, you cannot do it in the big group, but you can on the Sourdough Marketplace. So all these great t-shirts, you know, I can't right now, I have to feed my starter or whatever it is, right? So we've chit-chatted long enough now that I can do my second set of stretches and folds. I didn't mean to do this. I have stuff to do today, but since you're here, I'll do my second set. So if you look at this dough, it's now very smooth compared to how it started. So we mixed it, it was shaggy, very shaggy. We did our first stretch and fold, it was less shaggy, but still, you know, like still kind of lumpy looking. When we were mixing our dough, it stuck to everything. My hand was like a glove of sourdough that was like this thick, right? And if I tried to pick it up, it just ripped. I could just pull chunks of it out. On my first set of stretches and folds, it still stuck to my hand a little, right? It still ripped when I pulled it up, but by the end of that stretch and fold, it was starting to resist and build its own elasticity. With stretching and folding, what we're trying to do is get it to stop sticking to everything else and stick to itself instead. So this is going to be my second stretch and folds, and you should be able to see that it's stronger now than it was on that first one. So I'm just going to reach under, and just like before, I can lift it up really high, and if I pull it hard enough, it will rip. But it's taking more time to rip than it did on that first stretch and fold, right? So I'm just gonna go around, and you'll notice that on this stretch and fold, it starts resisting me a lot more. So see, if I grab this, on that first one, I could pull it way up, but now just even by the fourth or fifth fold over, when I pull, see, it's resisting. And we haven't built enough strength yet, but I can now pick up this dough in one piece, and it's going to rip. It's not strong enough yet, right? If I could stick my thumb through, see, it's not quite strong enough yet, but look how much stronger it was. So if you join later, go back to this video, will get posted on the page, go back to the beginning and watch how sticky it was, and look how much strength has been built in it. So I've got my second set of stretches and folds done. I'll have 2 more, then I'll separate my dough into my bulk proofing containers, and we'll go. So I'm going to wrap up. Thank you all so much for coming in today. So many great questions, so many of you here. I love doing it. It's definitely a little bit more fun to do these lives when people come. So I appreciate you all for being here. For those of you who sent stars, thank you so much. For those of you who like the lives and want to make sure you don't miss them, be sure to follow the page. You know, there's all kinds of options you can follow, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Every Monday night at 7 p.m. Eastern, I'm on StarCam. It's posted at the top of the page. There's also an event for it, starcam.com/app. You'll actually see the event there. You can register for it. Come see me every Monday. That gives you the opportunity to upload videos of yourself with your question in words, or your dough, or whatever it is, and I can watch it. You can see me watch it, and we can respond and talk about your dough. So I'd love to see you there. Hildy says, do you have to fold till you get a window pane? The window pane is great. It's a really good, and so what the window pane is where you take your dough with slightly wet hands and start to stretch it. And if you stretch it and it goes see-through, then that means that your gluten structures are bound and there's enough strength in there. What we say for beginners is just do 4 sets of stretch and folds. That's going to be enough. Once you get used to how the dough feels, you can start playing with the window pane. So optional process. but a good one. Most of the optional and advanced processes are good ones, and you should do them. Just at first, keep it simple. Thank you, Sarah, for all you do. You're so welcome. Thank you guys all for being here. So I'm going to say bye for now. Over the next hour or two, I'll make sure I get this video posted, answer any questions. If you're watching this and it's after the live, post your questions in the comments. Facebook notifies me. I always come in and answer. And make sure you check out all of the links up in the description. We'll see y'all later. Thanks for being here.